Rashema Ingraham, the Executive Director for Waterkeepers Bahamas. I'm still that.
Are you a native Grand Bahamian?
I am a native Grand Bahamian. I was born and raised in Grand Bahama, but I like to tell people the story about how my mother is from Bimini and my father is from Cat Island. So I am an all-around Bahamian.
Yes, in the interest of public declaration, Rashema and I are cousins on her mother's side, the Bimini side.
Right, the good side.
I was going to say the best side, right? But, Cat Islanders, I'm sure there are many great secrets down there. Thanks so much for joining us today. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what your experiences were with hurricanes before Dorian. Have you ridden them out before? Do any of them in particular stand out in your mind as either great or terrible, depending on how you clarify it?
I think the first hurricane that I can really remember would have been Hurricane Floyd in 1999. And the reason why I remember that was because that was the point when the water quality in Grand Bahama changed. Before then, we would brag about having such good water and, throwing it in the faces of Nassauvians that we could drink water from our taps. But after Hurricane Floyd, things changed.
You would have been relatively young then. So what was your knowledge of water quality at that time?
There was no knowledge other than the fact that we had those bragging rights with Nassau, because it was always a bit of a competition between Grand Bahamians and Nassauvians.
So you knew in that moment, because after the hurricane, you no longer drank tap water in your homes?
Right, yeah. So from that point after the storm, we had discontinued drinking tap water and we started to purchase water from Sunny Isle.
And when we say we, I still think that that's pretty much like a privileged place that every Bahamian, perhaps the average Grand Bahamian family, perhaps the average Bahamian family does not enjoy.
Right.
What would you say would have been the likelihood then of some Grand Bahamians, in spite of those warnings, in spite of the awareness that the water quality was less than it previously was, perhaps less than it ought to have been in order to really be safe for drinking? How exceptional do you think it may have been that people just continued the way they had in spite of the change?
People continue because of resources, whether they are limited or they're extensive. I know that even after Hurricane Dorian, I just want to throw this in there, that we had the warnings about discontinuing the use of the water, but people had to because there was no other way for them to be able to access clean drinking water, which is an issue. And it was an issue during Hurricane Floyd as well. The thing about Hurricane Floyd was that we were able to quickly bounce back into getting good quality water running into our systems, where if you were to boil it for a certain period of time, it would be fine. Even immediately after that, just using the sanitary tablets, then it would be fine as well. But we're to the point now where a total revamp of the system needs to be in place, especially in communities that may not really have access to modern plumbing. Communities like the Lewis Yard, Hunters area, where you have people using city stations or city pumps to tote water from the pumps to their homes, or they're using wells, and the well water at times is contaminated. But you have people who aren't knowledgeable of the fact that there's bacteria in the water and how to prevent the bacteria from growing.
All right, so this is huge. Let's go back then, and because I think one would think because we live in an island nation, we're natives to an island nation, that people just have an awareness of what water conservation is, conservation of any kind is, environmental awareness is,
right.
The assumption is that is at the all-time high, that is our number one priority as an island nation, as a tourism-driven nation by our natural environment. What brought you into conservation?
conservation is in my blood, right? There's no way of going around it. And so my grandfather and his siblings, they all lived off of the water. So yes, you talk about tourism and the fact
like how you
that
talking about my granddaddy like this is just yours, okay? But I can let you have it, okay? Because I am going to just be an interviewer who is not the sibling of your grandfather's.
You're on that side.
I know. Go ahead. Tell your story.
So for Bahamians, when we look at the ocean, when we look at our mangrove systems, when we look at coral reefs, we look at them with the thought that the tourists can benefit from these things and not necessarily us. So we've been conditioned really to provide for others, whether it's as fishermen to provide for those who may buy our stock or fishermen who may be providing for their families. We've been conditioned to be servants, and that's a good thing, right? Because we are all servants of each other because we're children of God. But when you think about the conditions of water conservation and how it affects us as Bahamians, natives who live here, we're not really fully aware because we're only thinking about how visitors are going to benefit from water quality. Are we cleaning our beaches? Is it beautiful enough for them and not beautiful enough for us? Or how do we benefit from these things? And how should we learn about bacteria levels in our water? How should we learn about whether or not it's safe or not to swim?
If you can swim.
Right. If
Which
you
is
can
a
swim.
huge...
Yeah, that's another issue. Can't get into that.
No. We have to touch on it because we're there.
Right.
It's such a huge issue. Living in an island nation, most people with ready access to the ocean.
Right.
And I would say a significant, if not a majority of the population is unable to swim. Would you say that's fair?
I would agree. I would say that, and we did a sit-down interview with a guy from West End a few days ago, and he said, if you look at the Bahamas, and I'm going to use his words because they're perfect. If you look at the Bahamas, we're 100,000 square miles. Right? And only 5,000 square miles of that is land. So if you put that in percentage, 95% of that is water. But 95% of the population is either afraid of the water or can't swim.
Man, it can't be that high. You think so?
Right? And so if you were to just take a walk for about 15 minutes and you get 100 people and you ask them, do you swim? Are you afraid of sharks? I'm sure you will have a high percentage of persons telling you that. And so those issues really concern me. And that's really what kind of motivates me to continue this work. We're afraid of the water. We're unable to swim. And we aren't aware of the conditions of the water that we're drinking or the water that we're swimming in.
And again, do you think that just ties back into the idea that our natural resources are merely a product / service that we provide to others? I mean, where would the fear of the ocean come from in a people? No, I mean, I'm curious. I mean, because one can understand if you had a traumatic experience,
right.
You experienced a loss via the ocean, but in many of these instances, that is not the case. And even if it is the case, it is unknown to them that somewhere in their family history, somewhere in their network that they experience this loss, but yet they still have this, I would describe it as a holiday relationship with the ocean, even with the outdoors. Mm-hmm. I mean, would you say that that's fair?
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like Easter Monday, Easter Sunday, Emancipation Day, we hit the beach.
Yeah, and you have children, and but I think it even extends more broadly to outdoors in general. Mm-hmm. This generation and maybe the generation prior to us, especially being the first generation of modern Black Bahamians, right. If you will, sought to distance themselves from those things of their foreparents. Mm-hmm. The outdoors, the ocean, agriculture, all of these things found themselves into concrete jungles of air conditioned, banks, development, this,
right.
anything that was air conditioned was, somehow better. And, I could remember as a child always wanting to go to the beach, but it really, I did go. I think I probably met more than the average Bahamian, but it still was a treat.
Right.
Whereas in the American imagination, especially, their idea is that we go to the beach every day. I can't believe that you live there. You don't go there every day. Now, of course, we know that they don't go to Rodeo Drive every day.
Right.
So that those two things are, those are false positives. But in the sense that you are trying to educate Bahamians about the importance of water, be it the ocean, be it drinking water, I would suppose that must tie in some way to an understanding about what keeps those water sources healthy, and what we hope to do to slow down, to interrupt, to disrupt altogether, perhaps the developing of these mega storms. So, in terms of talking about pollution and plastics and all of these other things, how does that work intersect with hurricanes?
Right. So I want to go a step back to what you mentioned earlier, and why are we afraid? And so you have to think about, how did we get here, right? The story about how did we get here, and those experiences or those traumatic moments are now in us, embedded in us. Even though we weren't the slaves that came over here, they told their children stories, and their children told their children stories. And so now, when you think of water, right, that's dangerous.
Right. Y'all don't be out there playing. That water ain't nothing to play with.
But they don't know why they're saying that's dangerous, right? They just knew that their grandparents told them the story about why that's dangerous, or why you shouldn't go in the ocean, or why sharks are going to eat you away, or the lusker in the blue holes, things like that, right?
And I would guess from Ms. Rashema that what you're inadvertently telling me is that the sharks are not going to eat me away, which I'm not so sure of at this moment. I mean, just in the interest of being transparent.
I mean, it's like saying you're going to drive your car and you're not going to get into an accident. It's something that I can't answer because we're unsure about what will likely happen.
Sure.
But when you can understand the stories that are with us, that we carry with us, the silent stories, then you could appreciate the trauma that people have, Black Bahamians have, when it comes to the water. We're slaves, right? We're not slaves today, but we're descendants of slaves. And to imagine the stories that they went through and their grandparents told their grandchildren and so on and so forth, we carry those stories. So Easter Sunday it is, right? Because let's have a celebration by the water because we know the healing powers of the water, but we're not doing it because we're not going through that process again of what our ancestors went through. And so that's what we're trying to break out. And with a lot of our programs, we're trying to gradually get our youth involved in understanding the relationship that water has to us as Black people, as servants, as protectors. And so when you talk about plastics and all these other things, yes, it's our job to really get them to understand how they are to protect this wonderful, rich medicine that we have in the ocean and the salt air, and to remove plastics as much as possible. And to understand the relationship between hurricanes and global warming and all these things, and how we should adapt, not how we should reduce these hurricanes, because there's only one being that would be able to do that there, but there are practices that we can put in place to reduce the effects of it. And so let's plant more mangroves, let's plant more seals, let's make sure that we're not encouraging fossil fuel usage as much as other developed countries are doing it. Let's find sustainable ways to live, because we are the ones who are at the forefront of the impacts of hurricanes. we're also at the forefront of watching fish stock decrease, watching coral reefs die, watching mangroves be removed because we want to put mega hotels. So we want to teach our people how important it is for us to live in balance with nature and each other.
How difficult is that? I mean, when you say teach our people, are you primarily teaching young people? And so are we like a generation away from a radical shift? Or is this a case, I mean, obviously we'd love it to be a case of the chicken and the egg, but is that realistically possible when people have been so conditioned to behave in ways that are harmful to nature and are harmful to them, ultimately to themselves?
You know, the sad reality is that we see the effects of strengthening storms. We see the intensity, we see the frequency, but we are a generation away. And I say that is because now we have to really condition our younger people to understand how they can build careers around being environmentally sensitive. Also understanding the ecosystems and the roles that they play, but getting them away from those stories that their grandparents have embedded in their parents. Right? And so you talked earlier about how we've become like this concrete jungle population. They don't want to go in the sun. Why? It's vitamin D, right? They don't want to go in the ocean. Why? It's salt, and salt purifies everything, right? And so their parents aren't doing it, but they are so open and willing and able, they will do it. Their parents are going to stay in the houses, and they're only going to come out during Easter Monday.
Well, you know, as you speak to the curative and the medicinal powers of nature, I guess we've seen that time and time again with the discussion about confronting, COVID-19, living amid a pandemic, getting outside, getting exercise, and all of those things are very timely, especially for a population like that of Grand Bahama that has seen so much devastation, has endured so much trauma, has really buried so much pain. How do we begin to redress, if you will, having people make that hard decision between feeling like, okay, this plastic bag is convenient and useful for me now, versus if I take recyclable bags or if I take a brown paper bag, it's less harmful on the environment, and ultimately it benefits me more later and more than me later. I mean, how do you, I guess when people are in the survival mode that so many people on Grand Bahama are at this point, I mean, and have been, as you noted, for some time, 2 decades now. I guess, it's just the sense of trying to balance out those things where, even if you know better, better seems more difficult. Better seems quite frankly, impossible to really carry out, because I am just so inundated with my basic needs, and I just don't have time to think about your water quality. I mean,
basic needs change as time goes on, and if you think about 20 years from now, right? 20 years from this point, 20 years ago, cell phones weren't a necessity. Cell phone still isn't a necessity, right? But you did not have that many people walking around with cell phones, especially when I was a child. And I'll go back to when I was a child and we had the big satellite dish in the yard, right? Not everyone had...
Such a mark of elegance.
Not everyone had the satellite dish. And then there were 2 different sets of satellite dishes, okay? And so we had the older one. I just needed to correct your statement.
Exactly.
But
luxury.
But those things weren't necessities. Cell phones, again, weren't necessities, but we've conditioned ourselves to making them a part of our daily lives. And it took time. But with the change and the conscious and awareness of why certain materials or products aren't necessarily beneficial to us, not useful, beneficial to us, it's going to be a approach that has to be taken by our governments, by our schools, by everyone. It has to be a shift in lifestyle, and it will not happen in 2 years. It will not happen in 5 years.
But if it didn't happen, or hasn't happened enough or quickly enough in the wake of Hurricane Dorian, of course, the worst hurricane on modern record.
Right.
What more, or what else could it possibly take in order for us to focus on that which is, as you said, beneficial versus only that which is useful or utilitarian in this moment?
It comes down to public awareness and education, and whether or not organizations like ours and others are going to really take the mantle and go out into communities and talk about the issues and give people alternatives. Don't tell me not to use plastics unless you come with an alternative. Don't put a restriction on me unless I can understand how that will then be transferred into community development projects. So these are things that need to go hand in hand. I can, if I don't know where else to litter, but you don't provide me with trash bins, I will litter. So we have to work as a government. We also have to work as NGOs and community partners to provide the resources, including educating the people.
Let's talk about litter, okay? Because if there's anything that is ever littered anywhere, it certainly was Dorian. So in the wake of Hurricane Dorian, we have basically the ocean onto land, things from the depths of the ocean onto land,
right.
Things from the land into the depths of the ocean. I mean, I know people right now who have not seen their major appliances. We're not talking about photo albums or jewelry or small items. I mean, we are talking about, I had a washer, dryer, refrigerator, stove in this house when I left it, and now it's gone.
Yeah.
And I think if that is not a wake-up call as to the depth of the ocean, because we're not seeing those things out there, but we know that they must be out there.
Right.
But what would you say about just the level of devastation to the physical environment in the wake of Hurricane Dorian?
It was painful to go out and take note or do assessments after Hurricane Dorian, especially driving to East End. That drive hurt the most because you had large patches of mangroves placed into the roadways, and you had chunks of defense systems, natural defense systems, ripped away by a storm. And I know that they did their job, and it could have been worse if they weren't where they were. But to see that they took the brunt of the storm for us, it was just sad to be able to take that drive and watch as they were just withering away because they were away from their environment. And what were we going to do with them? We probably were going to shred them. And so, yes, life after death, right? Because now you can repurpose the mangroves, repurpose the soil. Yes, perfect. But now we have to build back. And we keep talking about building back better, but we have to talk about build back better, which includes building these ecosystems or building barriers or breakways or jetties or whatever system that we can design that helps to allow these systems to grow again, as well as help us in a very sensitive or minimal way where it does not affect sand flow, it does not affect the natural secretion, it does not affect whatever it is that nature was intending for systems to regenerate.
And I think this ought to be said because maybe viewers up until this point think that you are an executive speaking on behalf of a cause with real, I suppose they would say highfalutin ideas that are not real, that don't really get to the heart of what people face. And so I think it's important that people understand that you yourself lost much in Dorian. Personally, your home, your mother's home.
Right.
I mean, and I think people ought to understand that, because other than that, the conversation they think is, simply academic, is simply an intellectual exchange because, she don't know what it's like to actually lose. She don't know what that feel like. So she here talking about clean water. I lose my house. And
right.
And I mean, I really do think that it's important that people understand that you are navigating personal loss, personal reconstruction, personal trauma, and still having to jump in a car. I don't know, how did you have a car?
No, we lost the cars.
Right. So how did you get to East End?
Right. Yeah. I think we were.
I think that for some people, they don't get it.
Yeah, I think
two things can be true at once. Basically, is what I'm saying to you.
We were in a state of shock I would say that I probably was in a state of shock for about 3 months until it finally hit home that home is no longer home, right? And so I'll get to that, but being home and getting the knock on the door from the police officer that you need to vacate right now because the water is coming. We were questioning, what do you mean water is coming? We're in central part of the island. We should be good. And he said, you have about 10 minutes for y'all to just grab whatever you could grab and leave. And we had to. We had about 10 persons in our house, a 1 week baby in the house as well. So of course, we were concerned about things like that, the safety of everyone, and where is the water, right? And we were able to find refuge in a colleague's house, and we stayed with him for over a month, maybe about 6 weeks. But while we were there, because we knew that we needed to help others, like I say, we're conditioned as Bahamians, some of us a little bit more than we should be. We're conditioned to help people. So right away we were thinking, how do we help them? How do we get supplies? How do we get our friends from the US to bring water? Because we knew that water was going to be an issue. And so automatically we got into work mode. Losing a house, losing a car, things like that was not as important for us as saving a life and helping others to be able to cope with whatever they may have lost. So, I mean, it's life. We're Grand Bahamians. We deal with hurricanes.
Grand
right.
Bahamians.
We're great. we're great.
Yeah, at this point, having endured so much in the last 2 decades, so much. First and foremost, yes, hurricanes. Added to that, a lagging economy.
Right.
One interview.
It's a hurricane.
Described it as a stopped. This is not lagging. This is stopped.
Right.
Lagging is not sufficient. But I think that it is so powerful that despite your own losses, the focus was on others. And I think that this is true for so many people.
Yeah.
I know that it's true.
Yeah.
I know that it's true. I mean, I saw it for myself, that people were able to contain the depths of their own loss and their own pain and push past that in order to help other people, whether they had a home or didn't have a home, or it needed to be gutted or it wasn't gutted, or you know.
And if you didn't have a home, somebody thankfully had a home that you could sleep on the floor. Like all of us slept on the floor. We can't be that highfalutin where we don't remember those times when it was 6 of us sleeping in a full-size bed as children, right?
Yeah.
So we know how to do these things. And I also want to point out that we had so many people, like you say, who just got out there and took action, but you had people from many different sectors, and that's what we have to remember. You will have people who care about nature and how nature affects people. You will have people who care about the social aspects of people's being, so they would want to comfort you and comfort your psychological state of mind. You would want people who will feed you, and so you had those charities, World Central Kitchen being one of them, who fed the people. And so you had so many different sectors coming together to assist. And that should always happen in a community for it to be a healthy community, where you have the environment, you have religion, you have social, you have financial, all coming together to help people.
Definitely. And one of the ways they immediately did, as you said, have to come together was around this issue of water, because there was no water. I mean, you know, and here was the thing. I think that a lot of people don't realize. I might have had sufficient water for my home for a long while. But in our instance, 3 turned into 5, turned into 7. And so the resources that you have was stretched really, really thin.
Yeah.
You know, I had enough water to perhaps last me a week or 2, but not when the house's population is tripled overnight. And I mean, in some instances, to say that there were 7 people in one home is, I mean, laughable, because they had 17 people in a home or 27 people in a home, right? So we find that water was the most precious, I think, commodity after the hurricane. And, you know, and I really was just so encouraged, not only by the responsiveness of people in different infrastructures, whether it was a Rotary or whether it was a private person like Camden Security or Polymers, you know, and, you know, people were so respectful of other people. You know, I think that's so important, that even when faced with being deprived with the most important resource that there is, you know, people stood on lines, you know, they said thank you, they helped each other, you know, and just hoping that that kind of spirit crosses into environmentalism in a substantial way. Because it is heartbreaking to see us not care for our natural environments in the way in which we should. And particularly heartbreaking as well for us not to be cognizant of the many, many Bahamians who don't have a real viable choice to do anything other than consume this water. So when you look at the, I mean, tell us what that means in terms of one's physical body, one's health systems. Like what does it mean to have either, you know, swam in water that you advised us not to swim in, to drink water from the tap that you advised us not to drink? I mean, what does that mean? Because I think when people don't see an immediate repercussion, an immediate negative consequence, they assume that there's none.
The Ministry of the Environment is now really mobilizing themselves to push that message out there. And that's why I say it needs to be holistic. This public awareness needs to be it needs to be holistic. I would like to see them move quicker, especially with promoting their environmental officers, so that their environmental officers are able to do more, because NGOs have limited resources. But when you have people on the beach and the state of the water is not the best for swimming, or you have people using well water and it's not the best for drinking and they don't know how to filter it or how to purify it. And I don't even want to talk about the fact that Grand Bahama is trying to find proper medical facilities, right? So I wouldn't even talk about the issue that can cause. But if we were a Miami Beach or Fort Lauderdale Beach on the weekend, we're talking about hundreds or thousands of people on the beach, and the water quality is not the best. And we don't have a hospital that's able to accommodate these people. And then you have people going with upset stomach and trying to figure out why they're vomiting, and they don't feel right. But we can't really point to why they're feeling that way. We're doing construction and we're dredging in communities that don't have proper waste management or septic tanks, and we're dredging into these grounds, and it's affecting our water table, right? And so you have a neighbor who may be right on the side of you who's using that well water. And so what happens then? You have human waste that now interacts with the system, and they're not purifying their water. So I don't even want to get into, because I'm sure you could kind of understand where I'm going with the types of illnesses that may occur.
I can. Especially when you talk about the well, but I think that we just take for granted that the ocean is resilient.
It is.
I know, but to a point, right? I mean, we need to help it maintain its resilience. We can't keep dumping into it, polluting in it, and assume that, it'll be okay.
Right.
But again, I do think that ties into our own kind of self-medicating. It'll be okay. We're okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Right.
And so we tend to have that feeling that, I don't know, either it will resolve itself or someone else will come and resolve it. But that, I'm bothering with that. That ain't my job. Like,
the thing about it is, nature will always find a way to resolve itself, even if it includes removing us out of the equation.
I don't want it to resolve itself with category 15,000 hurricane. But seriously, I mean, but it is striking that you would describe it like that. And I mean, I consider myself a fairly well-versed person, and even to some degree what you're saying, I have to think differently about. I mean, I have all the principles, but I don't think that I have really tethered them back to the very serious consequences. I mean, they're not at the forefront of my mind.
Right.
No, you shouldn't do this.
Yes. But then why shouldn't you do this? And that's why we need to be there too.
Well, I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, because I guess just saying because it's nastiness.
It's not enough.
It's not enough, right? So you talked, specifically about what happened in the wake of Floyd. So then, if it was already bad with Floyd, then what is the state of it in the wake of Dorian? What is this? Where are we? Where are we with the ocean, and where are we with drinking water? Now, I guess maybe 18 or more months out of Dorian.
Right after Dorian, you talked about how so many persons came to our aid, right? And they did. What I noticed, and I think a lot of us got an appreciation for NGOs and the work that they do and the reach that they have after that, because you had maybe over 20 NGOs that came here specifically to provide ways for Bahamians, Grand Bahamians, Abaconians to have access to clean water. Clean water, or access to clean water, is a human right. And I think now we understand that, right? So they came and they provided filters, buckets, RO systems, reverse osmosis systems, stations, rain catchment stations, everything that you can think of. And so now we see what we are able to do, because we weren't able to do some of these things because we're in a system where a lot of it is regulated, right? And you have certain areas on the island where it's inappropriate to have certain structures or certain wells or rain catchment. It's limited where you can do those things. But I think we now need, after seeing the extent of the damage to the wells, we need to move away from that. We need to become a little bit more relaxed with our restrictions as a municipality. To allow people, especially during hurricane season, to store certain units so that we're not running as chickens without heads trying to find water. And so thankfully you had Rotary, you had Candid Security, you had Polymers, and I think there was another one that was able to provide water for a limited time until those NGOs came in with their systems. But if it was not for the NGOs who were giving advice and suggesting and saying certain things to the right people, I think we might have still been in the state where let's just allow the rainwater to flush out the wells and hope that the water quality changes, right? So now we've seen where Grand Bahama Utility, and I want to say their name, Grand Bahama Utility has now purchased the reverse osmosis system for the island because it's necessary. We have to shift. We have to become adaptable to our conditions. Our conditions is we're going to have strong hurricanes. It's going to affect our water quality. It's going to affect our coastal communities. So how do we now build back better?
Build back better. Is that your hope for Grand Bahamians and Bahamians and our environment?
Build back better with an understanding of why we're doing these things. Yeah, so that's the hope.
That's a lot of hope.
Yeah, I know.
It's a lot
we're
of
hopeful
education.
people, right?
I do. I do think that I know that we're resilient.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that we are as hopeful as we formerly were. I think that we have a tendency to push through and to bury, and hope is nothing but having something to look forward to. And I think in some ways we are hopeful, but in terms of tethering that hopefulness to an actual plan of action and being persistent in it,
right?
Especially when it's uncomfortable, or in the case of what we now experience in the grocery store, that you got to take all your grocery in your hand because you don't have a bag.
Put it in the trolley and tell them you'll bring the trolley back, right?
Which to me was startling because back when we were children, the supermarket would have their trolley caged in, and you couldn't get it beyond a foot or two of the doorway. Right. So now I can take this out, and you trust me to bring it back.
Right.
I think to your point, that shows the ways in which we can be responsive to change. Once upon a time, a face covering indicated some criminality, some criminal intent. Right. And now it's
a lifestyle change.
Now it's what everyone does, if you have the good sense that God gave you.
Right.
So having said that, what is your hope for Grand Bahamians who are sea-facing, who are maybe not as inward-looking because they're so inward-leaning? If we have this conversation 10 years from now, what do you hope is the same? What do you hope is different?
You said the word resilient, and I like to be careful with that too, because resiliency also makes us comfortable in our current state. And so we don't have that sense of urgency to move as we should. But it was ground zero. Hurricane Dorian was ground zero for us. And so, yes, we are resilient. Yes, we are hopeful. But how do we become actionable in our doings now? And so 10 years from now, we should all be able to understand the importance of swimming and life-saving skills as a people, right? We should also be able to understand how we are in a position to be able to protect ourselves by using nature as our defense systems. And so how do we plant back our mangroves? How do we plant back our seals? How do we ensure that our coral reefs are healthy enough to be that barrier to prevent the intense impact of storm surges? So we need to implement these educational modules into our schools, into our everyday talks. I mean, yeah, we can slam dominoes, but what happened to you during the storm so that I can learn from you? So opportunities like this that you're doing to sit down and talk to people and create databases of stories, this is education in itself. So now how do we take all of these stories and turn it into a learning tool for us to know what policies we're going to put in place? So we have a consciously aware group of environmentally swimmers who are building back better because they understand that clean water is a human right.
Clean water is a human right. I want to thank you for that. Thank you for building back better, not just as a four-wall structure, cemented house with a metal roof, or even an elevated house with a roof or a manhole that leads to the ceiling. I think in all of these other ways, to build back not just better homes, but better communities.
Right.
And that includes the way in which we think about ourselves and each other and also our environment. So thank you.
Thank you.
Interview by Dr. Crystal A. DeGregory, April 2021. Funding for this interview was provided by the International Organization for Migration Bahamas. Dorian and beyond, battered but not broken. For more information, please visit us online at www.dorianandbeyond.org.